No healer could save the Alpha King's pup until the Wolfless Omega did the impossible. Tell the king to prepare the pyre. I would rather tell him to tear your throat out with his teeth, Benedict. Do not ask me to deliver a death sentence to a father who has not slept in a week. It is not a sentence, Evander. It is mercy. The boy's lungs are filled with fluid that no magic can drain. The moon goddess is calling the pup home. Who are we to bar the door? We are his guard. We hold the line, even against death. Then you hold the line against a ghost. The air dies tonight. Rain assaulted the high towers of Blackwood Citadel, hammering against the stone like the fists of a vengeful god. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating, heavy with the metallic scent of ozone and the damp, sour smell of fear. Aveline moved through the servants' corridors like a shadow detached from its caster. In a kingdom ruled by shifting beasts and raw power, being wolfless was a curse that rendered her invisible. To the high-born wolves, she was nothing more than furniture, a peculiar genetic defect, an omega born without a wolf spirit, without a scent, and therefore without worth. But invisibility had its privileges. It allowed her to hear things she shouldn't. She balanced a silver tray of untouched venison broth, her knuckles white against the metal. The corridors were unusually empty of guards. They were all congregated near the royal wing, their golden armor dull in the flickering torchlight. Lord Benedict says it is a blood curse, a maid whispered, pressing herself into an alcove as Aveline passed, sent by the northern covens. Benedict says a lot of things when the king isn't listening, another servant muttered back, scrubbing a spot of soot from the floor. I heard the pup turned blue, like ice. Aveline's eyes narrowed, but she didn't slow her pace. Blue. Not the grey of death, but the blue of oxygen deprivation. She reached the heavy oak doors of the royal wing. This was as far as she was supposed to go. She was to hand the tray to the guard, bow her head, and retreat to the scullery to scrub pots until her fingers bled. That was the life of a wolfless, but the doors were slightly ajar. Through the gap, she saw him. Cedric Fairhaven, the Alpha King. He did not look like the monarch depicted in the tapestries in the Great Hall, imperious, golden-haired, and untouchable. He looked ruined. He sat in a chair beside the small canopy bed, his head in his hands. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the tense cords of his neck. Even from this distance, the sheer radiating power of his grief made the air ripple. It was a physical weight pressing against Aveline's chest. Beside him stood Benedict Silverthorn, the High Healer, clad in robes of crushed velvet. Benedict was a man of sharp angles and soft words, a viper wrapped in silk. "Sire," Benedict purred, placing a hand on the king's shoulder. "The herbs from the east have failed. The chanting has failed. The pup's spirit is too weak to hold the shift. If he were a strong alpha—" "He is 5 years old." Cedric's voice was a low growl, vibrating through the floorboards. He didn't look up. "He is not supposed to be strong. He is supposed to be alive. Nature culls the weak, my king. It is the old way." Aveline felt a spike of cold rage in her gut. She knew that tone. It was the same tone the pack elders used when they looked at her, the dismissal of anything that didn't fit their mold of perfection. She looked at the child in the bed. The boy, Prince Silas, was small, his skin waxy and pale. But it was the sound of his breathing that stopped Aveline's heart. It wasn't the rattle of a curse. It was a whistle, high-pitched, mechanical. She had heard that sound before, years ago, in the lower villages where the wolves didn't go, where the humans lived and died by diseases the shifters ignored. She stepped forward. The movement was slight, but for an alpha king on the edge of madness, it was a thunderclap. Cedric's head snapped up. His eyes were gold, burning with a feral intensity that usually sent grown warriors to their knees. "Who is there?" he barked. Evander Ravenhill, the captain of the guard, materialized from the shadows near the door, blocking Aveline's path. His hand went to the hilt of his sword. "Just a servant, sire. Bringing the broth. I will remove her." "Wait," Aveline said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Evander looked down at her, surprised. Wolfless Omegas did not speak to captains, and they certainly did not speak to kings. "He isn't cursed," Aveline said, looking past the guard, locking eyes with the king. "And he isn't weak. He's drowning." Benedict turned, his lip curling in a sneer. "Remove this creature, Evander. She pollutes the air with her mediocrity." I said, "Wait." Cedric stood up. He was massive, filling the room with his presence. He walked toward the door, ignoring Benedict. He stopped inches from Evander, looking over the captain's shoulder at Aveline. "What did you say?" Cedric asked. His voice was dangerous, a coiled spring. "Your son," Aveline said, clutching the tray tighter. "He's drowning on dry land, and if you let that man keep feeding him fire, root, and magic, he will be dead by sunrise." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, holding its breath. "Insolence!" Benedict hissed, stepping forward, his robes swirling. "This is Aveline, the null, the empty one. She has no wolf, sire. She has no connection to the magic of our kind. She cannot possibly understand the metaphysical complexities of an alpha heir's transition. I understand that a throat closed by swelling needs air, not chanting." Aveline shot back. She didn't know where the courage came from. Perhaps it was the sight of the boy, so small in that massive bed. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of being invisible for 24 years. Cedric stared at her. He sniffed the air, searching for her scent, for her motive. But Aveline was a void. She smelled only of rain and dried lavender from the laundry. It clearly unnerved him. "Let her in," Cedric commanded. "Sire," Benedict protested. "She is unclean." I said, "Let her in." Cedric's growl dropped an octave, causing the glass in the windows to rattle. "If she is wrong, Evander can throw her from the parapet. But if she is right, I will hear her." Evander stepped aside, his expression unreadable, though his eyes lingered on Aveline with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Aveline set the tray down on a side table and approached the bed. Up close, the smell was overpowering. Sickness, sweat, and beneath it all, the cloying, sweet scent of the incense Benedict had been burning. She knelt beside the boy. Silas was sweating profusely, his chest heaving with the effort to pull in shallow breaths. His lips were tinged with violet. "Don't touch him, girl," Benedict warned, hovering like a carrion bird. Aveline ignored him. She placed her hand on the boy's neck. His pulse was racing, thready and frantic. She looked at the bedside table. A bowl of crushed herbs sat there. Fire root, wolf's bane, in small doses for strengthening, and crushed moon bloom. "You're giving him fire root to stimulate his wolf," Aveline said, looking up at Cedric. "You think his wolf is failing to manifest, so you're trying to force the shift." "It is standard procedure," Benedict said icily. "It's poison," Aveline corrected. "Not to a wolf, but to him. Look at his skin. The hives." She pointed to the faint, raised red welts along the boy's hairline, obscured by sweat. "He's allergic. His body is rejecting the stimulant, and the swelling is crushing his windpipe." "An alpha allergic to fire root?" Benedict laughed, a dry, cracking sound. "Impossible. It is the source of our strength." "He is 5, Aveline said, her voice turning fierce. "He is a child before he is a wolf. You are treating the beast and killing the boy." Cedric was beside her in an instant. He touched the welts on his son's neck, his fingers trembling slightly. The king looked at Aveline, and for a second, the mask of the alpha slipped, revealing a terrified father. "What do we do?" Cedric asked. He didn't ask his high healer. He asked the wolfless servant. "Stop the fire route immediately," Aveline ordered, slipping into the pragmatic mode she used when tending to the castle's horses or the kitchen staff who couldn't afford a healer. "We need to reduce the swelling. I need willow bark, cold compresses, and—" She hesitated. "I need honey mixed with silver needle tea. It counteracts the toxin in the throat." "Silver needle is a peasant's weed," Benedict scoffed. "Sire, this is madness. She is mocking our traditions." "Evander," Cedric said, his eyes never leaving Aveline's face. "Yes, my king? Get her what she needs. Now." "And Benedict?" Evander asked, his hand drifting to his sword again. Cedric stood slowly and turned to the high healer. The look on the king's face was terrifyingly calm. "Benedict, you will stand in the corner. If my son breathes easier within the hour, you will keep your station. If he does not," Cedric let the sentence hang in the air, sharper than any blade. Aveline didn't wait to hear the rest. She was already rolling up her sleeves, her hands moving to the boy's burning forehead. She wasn't a healer, not by title. She was just a girl who watched the world while the world looked right through her. And right now, she was the only thing standing between the Alpha King's heart and the grave. 3 hours later, the silence in the room was different. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was fragile, like spun glass. Prince Silas was sleeping. The terrifying whistle in his breath had smoothed into a soft, rhythmic intake of air. The violet hue had faded from his lips, replaced by a healthy, albeit pale, pink. Aveline sat on the floor beside the bed, her back against the heavy velvet drapes. She was exhausted. Her hands, which had been steady while she worked, were now trembling with the adrenaline crash. Cedric stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames. He hadn't spoken in an hour. He had simply watched her crush the willow bark, watched her spoon the tea into his son's mouth, watched her soothe the boy with whispers that had no magic in them, only comfort. Benedict had been dismissed an hour ago, sent away with a glare from the king that promised a reckoning later. Evander remained posted at the door, a silent sentinel. "You saved him," Cedric said. He didn't turn around. "The tea saved him," Aveline corrected softly. "I just knew which jar to open." Cedric turned then. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his face, high cheekbones, a jaw capable of violence, and eyes that were pools of molten gold. He walked toward her, and Aveline fought the urge to scramble to her feet and bow. She was too tired for protocol. He stopped in front of her. He towered over her seated form. "Why did you risk it?" he asked. "If you had failed, Benedict would have had you executed for interfering with a royal heir." "He was dying," Aveline said simply. "Does there need to be another reason? In this court?" "Always." Cedric crouched down. It was a shocking breach of hierarchy. Alphas did not crouch before Omegas, especially wolfless ones. He was close enough that she could smell him now. Cedar wood, rain, and the metallic tang of power. "You have no wolf," he observed, his voice lower, intimate. "No, sire. And yet you saw what the High Healer could not. You saw the boy, not the legacy." Cedric tilted his head. "Who are you, Aveline?" "I am nobody, sire. Just a maid. Do not lie to me," he rumbled softly. "Nobodies do not look kings in the eye and give orders." Suddenly, the doors swung open. A woman swept in, followed by a gust of cold hallway air. She was beautiful in a sharp, predatory way, with hair like polished obsidian, and eyes that scanned the room with calculation rather than concern. Callista, the daughter of the Northern Alpha, and the woman the council was pushing Cedric to take as a mate to secure the borders. "I heard the cry goes up," Callista said, her voice smooth, feigning distress. "Is the little prince? Has he passed?" She looked at the bed, and for a fleeting second, Aveline saw a flash of disappointment in Callista's dark eyes before it was masked by a performance of relief. "He lives," Cedric said, standing up and putting distance between himself and Aveline. "Thanks to this one." He gestured to Aveline. Callista's gaze landed on Aveline like a physical blow. She sniffed the air, her nose wrinkling. "The Wolfless girl, the one who washes the linens." She laughed, a sound like breaking ice. "Cedric, surely you jest. You let a defect touch the air." "That defect saved his life while your recommended physicians chanted useless rhymes," Cedric said coldly. Callista stiffened. "I only sought to help, my king. Benedict is the best in the realm." "Benedict is a fool, or worse." Cedric's eyes narrowed. "And I am done with fools." He looked back at Aveline, who was trying to merge with the shadows of the drapes again. "Aveline," Cedric said. It was a command. "Yes, sire." "You are relieved of your duties in the scullery. As of tonight, you are the governess of the prince. You will oversee his recovery. Nothing, food, medicine, or visitor, touches him without your approval. Not even me." The room gasped. Evander shifted his stance. Callista looked as though she had been slapped. "Sire," Aveline stammered, standing up. "I cannot. I have no standing. The court will eat me alive." "Let them try," Cedric said, a dark promise in his voice. He took a step closer to her, invading her personal space, claiming the air around her. "You saved my son when I could not. That makes you the most dangerous person in this castle, Aveline, because you possess the one thing they lack." "And what is that?" she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Sight," Cedric said. "You see the truth. And I need eyes that can see in the dark." He reached out, his hand hovering near her chin, almost touching her. The air between them crackled, not with the instant snap of a mate bond, but with something slower, heavier. A curiosity. A challenge. "Do we have an agreement, Aveline?" She looked at Callista, whose face was twisted in a mask of beautiful hatred. She looked at Evander, who gave her a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. And then she looked at the boy sleeping peacefully in the bed. "I will keep him safe," Aveline said, "but I do it my way. No magic, no politics." "Your way," Cedric agreed. "But be warned, little Wolfless. You have stepped out of the shadows and into the sun, and the sun burns." Aveline held his gaze. "I've been burned before, my king. I don't break easily." Cedric's mouth quirked up at the corner, a ghost of a smile on a face that hadn't smiled in years. "We shall see." The royal wing was a fortress, but to Aveline it felt more like a cage made of gold and silk. 3 days had passed since she had been named governess, and the silence from the court was deafening. It was the calm before the hunt, a breathless suspension of reality, where every shadow seemed to lengthen and every whisper in the corridor sounded like a threat. Inside the nursery, the air was thick with the scent of dried lavender and the faint, antiseptic smell of willow bark. Aveline moved through the room with the precise, quiet economy of someone who had spent a lifetime trying not to be seen. She adjusted the heavy velvet drapes, blocking out the grey winter light, and returned to the bedside. Prince Silas was awake. He was a quiet child, possessing his father's golden eyes, but none of the terrifying intensity that made the king so formidable. The boy watched Aveline with cautious curiosity as she checked his meals, sniffed his linens for foreign scents, and barred the door against well-wishers. She had become his gatekeeper, a barrier of flesh and bone between the air and a court that whispered of his demise. "My father says you have no wolf," Silas whispered on the fourth morning, clutching a velvet blanket to his chest. He was sitting up, the colour returning to his cheeks, though he still looked fragile, like a porcelain doll that had been cracked and glued back together. Evelyn paused in her task of arranging fresh winter berries in a silver bowl. She selected each berry carefully, checking for soft spots, for punctures, for anything that didn't belong. "That is true, Your Highness. Does it hurt?" he asked innocently, his head tilting to the side. "Being empty?" Evelyn's heart gave a painful squeeze. The question was not cruel. It was merely a child trying to understand a world that defined existence by the beast within. "It is not empty, little one," she said softly, sitting on the edge of the mattress. "It is just quiet. While everyone else has a storm inside them, crashing and howling, I have a still lake. It helps me see things the storm hides." Silas considered this, his small brow furrowing. "The storm is loud," he admitted in a small voice. "Sometimes I hear the others, the guards. Their wolves are angry. It hurts my ears." "I know," Evelyn soothed, smoothing his hair back. "That is why I am here. To be the quiet." The heavy oak doors creaked open, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the hushed room. Evander Ravenhill stood there, his face grim, his armor stained with the dust of the training yards. Behind him stood a procession of servants, their heads bowed, bearing wrapped gifts piled high on silver platters. "Tributes for the prince's recovery," Evander announced, though his hand rested uneasily on his sword hilt. His eyes darted around the room, checking the corners before settling on Evelyn. "From the Lady Callista and the Northern delegation. They insist that the prince receive them personally." Evelyn stood up slowly, placing herself between the bed and the servants. Her posture shifted, losing the servant's slouch and gaining the rigid spine of a protector. "Leave them on the table. Do not approach the prince." The servants, sensing the shift in power, or perhaps smelling the lingering scent of the Alpha King on her clothes, obeyed quickly. They deposited the bundles and scurried out, as if the room were on fire. Evander remained, kicking the door shut with his heel. "You are making powerful enemies, Evelyn," Evander murmured, walking over to watch her inspect the packages. "Callista is not used to being denied access. She claims she wants to comfort her future stepson. She has been weeping in the great hall, telling anyone who will listen that you are keeping a mother figure from a sick child." "She is not his mother," Evelyn muttered, picking up a box wrapped in red silk. "And she wants to finish what nature failed to do." She unwrapped the silk. Inside sat a beautifully carved wooden wolf, painted in intricate northern designs of black and silver. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, heavy, expensive, and smelling of pine and fresh varnish. Its eyes were two small sapphires that seemed to glint with malice. It seemed harmless, a toy for a boy who would one day lead the pack. But Evelyn didn't look at the artistry. She looked at the seams. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling for imperfections. Her fingertips, sensitive from years of scrubbing rough floors and mending delicate lace, grazed a microscopic ridge on the belly of the wooden wolf. A latch. "What is it?" Evander asked, his hand drifting to his weapon. "It's hollow," Evelyn whispered. She didn't open it immediately. She brought the toy closer to her face, not to look, but to smell. Beneath the pine and varnish, there was something else. Sweet, cloying, like flowers left too long on a grave. She popped the latch open with her thumbnail. Inside wasn't a mechanism or a hidden jewel. It was a small, porous sachet filled with dried purple petals and a fine, glittering dust. "Potpourri?" Evander asked, confused. Aveline recoiled, her hand shaking as she set the wolf down on the table. "Nightshade," she hissed, mixed with crushed glass. Evander went pale, the color draining from his face until his scar stood out in stark relief. "It's a subtle dust," Aveline explained, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "The mechanism is designed to puff it out when the toy is squeezed. If he played with this, if he hugged it while he slept, the dust would get on his hands. He would rub his eyes or put his fingers in his mouth. And the glass? Microscopic shards. They would cut the lining of his throat and stomach, ensuring the poison enters the bloodstream instantly. It would look like a relapse, a seizure, internal bleeding caused by the stress of the shift. Evander stared at the toy with horror. "It is a weapon." "Take it," Aveline said, looking up at him, her eyes hard. "Take it to the king. Show him what his peace offering from the north truly is." Evander reached for the wolf, then stopped. His hand hovered over the wood. "I cannot." "What do you mean you cannot?" Aveline snapped. "He nearly died." "If I take this to Cedric," Evander said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "he will kill Callista. He will tear her apart in the Great Hall. And then the Northern Alpha, her father, will declare war. We are not ready for war, Aveline. Half our forces are in the south dealing with rogues. If we accuse the Northern Alpha's daughter of assassination without proof that she put it there, we doom the kingdom. She will claim a servant tampered with it. She will claim you planted it to frame her." Aveline looked at the deadly toy, then at the innocent boy watching them with wide, confused eyes. The realization hit her like a physical blow, knocking the wind from her lungs. The law could not protect them. The king's title could not protect them. Justice was a luxury for those who could afford a war. "So we do nothing?" she asked, her voice hollow. "We survive," Evander said grimly. "That is the victory." Aveline grabbed the wooden wolf. She walked to the fireplace, where a log burned low. "Then we burn it," she said cold, throwing the masterpiece into the flames. The wood hissed, the varnish bubbled, and the purple petals curled into ash. "And we tell Callista the prince loved it so much he slept with it. We tell her he held it all night. Let her wonder why he isn't dead. Let her wonder if he is immortal. Let her fear me." Evander looked at the wolfless girl, really looked at her. He saw the soot on her hands, the fire in her eyes, and the absolute refusal to bow to the inevitable. For the first time in his service, he bowed to her. It wasn't the shallow nod given to servants. It was the bow given to a warrior. "As you command, governess." The winter solstice ball was mandatory. It was a display of power, a signal to the neighboring packs that the Fairhaven line was strong, that the air was recovering, and that the crown was unshakable. It was a lie wrapped in velvet, and everyone knew it. Cedric had insisted Aveline attend. "I need you watching the room," he had said earlier that evening, his voice leaving no room for argument as he paced the length of her small chamber. "Silas will be in the gallery with the guards, behind bulletproof glass. You will be by my side, or near enough to see what I cannot." Now, standing in the shadows of the great hall, Aveline felt exposed. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, a color Cedric had chosen. It was simple compared to the elaborate, gem-encrusted dresses of the high-born she-wolves, but the silk clung to her frame, liquid and cool against her skin, making her feel both armored and naked. The neckline was modest, but the back plunged low, exposing the skin where a pack mark should have been, but wasn't. The music was loud, a primal drumming that synced with the heartbeats of the shifters. The air was thick, almost viscous, with pheromones, dominance, desire, aggression, musk. To a Wolfless it was overwhelming, a sensory assault that made her head swim. "You look like a deer trying to blend in with a pack of lions," a voice drawled. Aveline turned to see Briseis, the general of the king's armies. Briseis was a towering woman, built like a mountain, with scars running down her bare arms and eyes like flint. She held a goblet of wine like a weapon. She was one of the few who hadn't sneered at Aveline's promotion. She respected survival, and Aveline was nothing if not a survivor. "Lions are lazy," Aveline replied, forcing her voice to remain steady as she scanned the crowd. "These are wolves. They hunt for sport." Briseis laughed, a sharp bark that made several nearby courtiers jump. "You have a tongue on you. Good, you'll need it. Look at them." She nodded toward the center of the room. Cedric was dancing with Callista. It was a political waltz, a battle of wills disguised as movement. Callista looked radiant in crimson, a splash of blood against the grey stone of the hall. Her body was pressed flush against the king's, her movements fluid and predatory. She whispered something in his ear, her lips brushing his jaw, her hand trailing down the front of his doublet. Cedric's expression remained stone, a mask of regal indifference, but his muscles were coiled tight. He moved with the deadly grace of an apex predator, but his eyes were not on his partner. They were scanning the room. They landed on Aveline. For a second, the music faded. The chatter of the court, the clinking of glass, the roar of the fire, it all fell away. Across the sea of spinning bodies, the Alpha King locked eyes with the Wolfless servant. There was a pull there, magnetic and terrifying. He wasn't looking at her like a tool anymore. He wasn't looking at her like a governess. He was looking at her like a man starving for something he couldn't name, something that wasn't power or politics. A flush rose on Aveline's neck. She shouldn't be seen by him. Not like this. Callista noticed the look. Her smile sharpened into a snarl. She spun Cedric away, pulling his attention back, her claws digging into the velvet of his doublet, leaving small snags in the fabric. "Careful," Briseis warned softly, noticing the interaction. "The North does not share prey, and make no mistake, girl. To her, the king is just the biggest trophy on the shelf." "I am not prey," Aveline said, though her hands were trembling. "Tonight," Briseis said, taking a long drink. "Everyone is prey." A waiter passed by with a tray of crystal goblets filled with spiced wine. The scent hit Aveline before the tray even reached them. The hall smelled of roasted meat, pine, and expensive perfume. But this new scent cut through it all. Amidst the warm notes of cinnamon and clove, there was a sour, metallic note. Bitter almonds. No, something sharper. Arsenic. Aveline froze. Her eyes snapped to the tray. It wasn't in all the cups, just one. The one with the golden rim, etched with the royal crest. The one the waiter was carrying directly toward the high table, where Cedric and Callista were approaching for the toast. Time seemed to slow down. She saw the waiter's blank expression, likely compelled by magic or bribery. She saw Benedict, who had reappeared for the feast, watching from the shadows with a smug, oily smile. She saw Cedric reach the table. "My king!" Benedict's voice rang out, silencing the music. He raised his own glass high. "To the health of the air, and to the union of North and South." The crowd cheered. Cedric reached for the golden-rimmed goblet. Aveline didn't think. The lake inside her, usually so still, rose up in a tidal wave. She moved. She wove through the dancers, ignoring the growls of annoyance as she bumped into high-ranking alphas. She slipped past the guards who recognized her too late. Cedric's fingers brushed the stem of the glass. He lifted it. No! Aveline lunged. She didn't have the speed of a wolf, but she had the element of surprise. She collided with the heavy oak table, her hand swiping out not to catch the cup, but to strike it. The goblet flew from Cedric's hand. It spun in the air, a glittering arc of death, before crashing onto the stone floor. The red liquid splattered like blood across Callista's pristine, crimson dress and onto the polished boots of the king. The music stopped instantly. The silence was absolute. "You clumsy, wretched little—" Callista shrieked, the sound piercing the air. She raised her hand to strike, her face twisted into a mask of pure, demonic fury. Her nails elongated into razor-sharp claws. Cedric caught Callista's wrist in midair. The sound of his growl was low, vibrating through the floorboards, shaking the banners on the walls. It was a sound that promised violence. "Do not," Cedric said, his voice a low rumble of absolute authority. "Touch her." "She ruined the toast," Callista spat, struggling against his grip, her eyes flashing red. "She is drunk! She is a disgrace! Look at her, throwing herself at you like a common—" Aveline stood up, her dress stained with the splashback, shaking uncontrollably. She pointed at the floor. "It wasn't wine," Aveline breathed. Her voice was a whisper, but in the dead silence of the hall, it carried to the rafters. "Look!" Everyone looked down. The puddle of wine on the floor was hissing. Bubbles rose from the stone as the liquid ate into the granite, releasing a foul, acrid smoke. The stone was turning black, dissolving under the potency of the acid. Cedric released Callista and looked at the floor. He stared at the spot where the liquid had eaten a hole in the rug. If he had drunk it, his throat, his stomach, his very insides would have liquefied in seconds. No healing factor could have saved him from that. He looked up. His eyes were entirely gold now, the wolf fully present at the surface. He looked at Benedict. The high healer was backing away, his face the color of ash, his eyes darting toward the exits. "Seize him," Cedric ordered. The command wasn't loud, but it was absolute. The fallout was chaotic. The ballroom erupted into pandemonium. Guards drew swords, northern delegates shouted in protest, and amidst the screaming crowd, Benedict had vanished, likely through a servant's passage, aided by those who wanted the king dead. The ball was over. The castle was on lockdown. Cedric found Aveline on the balcony of the royal wing an hour later. She was staring out at the snow-covered mountains, her arms wrapped around herself. The cold wind bit at her exposed skin, turning her breath into white plumes, but she didn't feel it. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her hollowed out and trembling. He didn't announce his presence. He didn't stomp or growl. He simply wrapped his own heavy, fur-lined cloak around her shoulders, engulfing her in his warmth and his scent. Cedar wood, rain, and the metallic tang of unspent fury. "You saved me," he said. His voice was rough, stripped of its royal polish. "Again, I have a habit of being in the way," Aveline replied, pulling the cloak tighter, burying her nose in the fur before she could stop herself. It smelled like safety. "You have a habit of being exactly where you are needed." Cedric turned her around to face him. His hands lingered on her shoulders, heavy and grounding. "They will come for you now, Aveline. Truly. The shadows are no longer safe. You humiliated Callista and exposed Benedict. You are a target. I know." "I can send you away," Cedric said, the words sounding like they cost him physical pain to speak. He looked at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "I can give you gold, a new name, a cottage in the southern isles where the sun always shines and the wolves are tame. You would be safe there. Aveline looked up at him. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the king who needed to protect his subject versus the man who wanted to keep her close. Is that what you want? To send me away? Cedric stared at her. The moonlight turned his eyes into liquid silver. No, it is the last thing I want. My wolf paces when you are not in the room. It is maddening. You have no scent, no magic, yet you are the only thing that calms the storm in my head. He stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. He blocked the wind. He blocked the world. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. It was a touch so tender, so at odds with the violence of the evening, that it terrified her more than Callista's claws ever could. Why, he whispered, why do you fight for a king who let you be treated like a ghost for years? Why do you risk your life for a court that despises you? I don't fight for the king, Aveline whispered back, her breath hitching as his thumb traced the line of her jaw. I fight for the father who sat by his son's bed and wept. I fight for the boy who asked me if my emptiness hurt. Cedric let out a shuddering breath. He leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. I am trapped, Aveline. The council demands a mate. They demand an alliance with the North to prevent war. They say I need a queen with strong magic to balance my own. Callista is the price of peace. Peace bought with poison is no peace at all, she said fierce, gripping the lapels of his coat. She brought a weapon into your son's nursery, Cedric. She tried to melt your throat. That is not a wife. That is an executioner. I know, but if I refuse her now, without proof that links her directly to the attempt, the Northern Pacts will march. They will claim I insulted their honor, and I cannot fight a war while watching my back for assassins in my own home. You won't be watching alone, Aveline vowed. Let me be your eyes, Cedric. Let me see what they hide. Let me stand where the light doesn't reach. And who will protect you? Cedric asked, his voice cracking. You are fragile, Aveline. One blow. You will, she said simply. Cedric's grip on her tightened until it was almost painful. He lowered his head, his lips hovering inches from hers. The tension was a pulled bowstring, vibrating with potential energy. If I kiss you, he warned, his voice a low growl, I will not be able to let you go. And if I claim you, without a wolf, it could kill you. The bond is too strong for a human soul. It burns. I am not human, Aveline said fiercely, tilting her head back, offering herself to the fire. I am wolfless. There is a difference. I am not empty, Cedric. I am just waiting to be filled. The double meaning hung in the freezing air, heavy and intoxicating. Cedric groaned, a sound of surrender, and tilted his head to claim her mouth. Clang! The sanctuary shattered. The warning bell from the outer wall began to toll, a deep, mournful, rhythmic sound that signaled only one thing. Cedric pulled back, his eyes instantly shifting to gold. The man gone, the king returned. He spun toward the horizon. The North! He snarled. Torches were flickering in the tree line, thousands of them, like a river of fire flowing toward the gates. They didn't wait for the marriage, Cedric said, his voice cold as the ice on the mountains. Benedict must have signaled them. They were waiting for me to die at the toast. When I didn't fall, they decided to push the gates, Aveline finished. He looked at Aveline, the moment of intimacy shattered by the brutal reality of war. Go to Silas, Cedric commanded, drawing a dagger made of black steel from his belt and pressing it into her hand. Take him to the safe room in the crypts. Bar the door. Trust no one but Evander. Cedric! She reached for him. Go! He roared, the alpha command slamming into her chest, forcing her feet to move. Aveline turned and ran, the heavy cloak trailing behind her like a shadow, clutching the dagger to her chest. Behind her, the king of the wolves let out a howl that shook the very foundations of the castle, a challenge to the encroaching dark. The crypts were the obvious choice. Too obvious. The stone corridor beneath the castle shuddered, dust raining down from the vaulted ceiling as another battering ram slammed into the main gates above. The sound was a dull, rhythmic thud, the heartbeat of an invasion. Aveline dragged Prince Silas toward the heavy iron door that led to the Undercity, but her hand froze on the cold latch. Her mind, unclouded by the panic of a wolf's instinct, raced through the variables. Benedict knew the castle's anatomy better than anyone. He knew the airflow of the tunnels. He would expect the king to send his son into the dark. "We aren't going down," Aveline whispered, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. She pulled Silas back, her grip on his small shoulder tight. "Benedict knows the crypts. He knows the scent trails. It's a trap." "Where then?" Silas whimpered, clutching the dagger she had given him with white-knuckled desperation. It was comically large in his hands, a tool of war for a child who should have been holding a toy. "Father said the crypts. We have to listen to the king." "Your father thinks like a wolf," Aveline said, crouching down to look him in the eye. "Wolves rely on scent and sound. They hunt in the dark. We need to go where no wolf can stand to be. We need to go where the air screams." She looked up. Through an arrow-slit window, she saw it, spiraling into the stormy night sky, a jagged silhouette against the lightning. The great bell tower of Blackwood. It was an ancient, imposing structure of black granite, rarely visited, because the resonance of the massive iron bells was known to be excruciating to the hypersensitive ears of shifters. "Up!" Aveline commanded, standing up. "Up!" Silas balked. But the storm. "Run!" They ran. They bypassed the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary and sprinted for the spiral staircase that hugged the tower's spine. The stairs were narrow, winding tight enough to make heads spin, slick with the damp of centuries. The climb was brutal. Aveline's lungs burned, her legs screaming in protest, but she didn't slow down. Below them, the sounds of battle grew louder, the clash of steel, the inhuman roars of shifting wolves, the screams of the dying. But as they climbed higher, a new sound began to dominate. The wind. It howled through the open arches of the tower like a banshee, tearing at their clothes, pushing them back. The higher they went, the thinner the air became, charged with the ozone of the lightning storm raging outside. Silas covered his ears, his face twisted in pain. "It hurts! It's too loud!" "I know," Aveline soothed, though she had to shout to be heard. She pushed him forward, her hand flat against his back. "But it will hurt them more. Keep moving, Silas. Don't look down." They reached the belfry just as the main gates below gave way, with a sickening crunch of wood and iron that vibrated up the tower's shaft. The sound of the invading army flooding the courtyard was a chaotic roar, a tidal wave of violence. But up here, it was drowned out by the wind whipping around the massive bronze bells. The belfry was a cavernous open-air platform. 3 giants hung in the darkness, the mourner, the king's voice, and the largest of them all, the Titan. The Titan was a monstrosity of iron and bronze, silent for 50 years, its mouth gaping wide enough to swallow a man whole. Aveline shoved Silas behind the thick wooden frame of the Titan. "Do not move," she ordered, grabbing his face to make him focus. "No matter what you see, do not uncover your ears. Do you understand? Keep them covered." Silas nodded, tears streaming down his face, curling into a ball in the shadows. Aveline turned to face the entrance. She stood in the center of the wind-lashed platform, her hair whipping across her face. She didn't have a sword. She didn't have magic. She just had a theory and the desperate hope that biology was on her side. She didn't have to wait long. The heavy oak door to the belfry flew open, torn from its hinges with a splintering crash. It skidded across the stone floor, stopping inches from Orvalane's feet. Callista stood in the doorway. She was breathtaking in her violence. Her crimson gown was shredded to ribbons, revealing fitted leather armor beneath. Blood, bright and oxygenated, not her own, smeared her cheek and matted her obsidian hair. She was panting, her chest heaving, steam rising from her skin in the cold air. But it was her eyes that froze Avelin's blood. They were glowing, a luminescent, hateful red. "Clever!" Callista shouted over the wind, stepping onto the platform. She winced immediately, her ears flattening against her skull as a gust of wind whistled through the bronze arches, creating a high-pitched harmonic. "Hiding him in the headache box. I tracked his fear all the way up the stairs. It smells like sour milk." "Step back, Callista," Aveline warned. She stood unarmed, her hands loose at her sides, forcing her breathing to remain even. "Or what?" Callista sneered, stalking forward. Her fingers twitched, and with a sickening crack, her nails elongated into razor-sharp claws, dripping with gore. She scraped them against the stone floor, sending sparks flying. "You will scrub me to death? You will fold me like a bedsheet? You are nothing, Aveline. A genetic mistake. A blank page in a book of legends. You don't even have the grace to be afraid." "I am terrified," Aveline admitted, her voice steady, her eyes locked on the predator. "But I am not helpless." Callista lunged. She moved with a blur of speed that the human eye could barely track. But Aveline didn't try to dodge the wolf. She dodged the air. She dropped flat to the ground, rolling toward the center of the room where the thick ropes of the bells dangled. Callista's claws raked the air where Aveline's throat had been a second before. The she-wolf spun around, snarling, but the wind was confusing her senses. The sheer altitude and the whistle of the air were disorienting her inner ear. "Stop running!" Callista screamed, leaping again. Aveline grabbed the heavy hemp rope of the Titan. She didn't have the strength to ring it properly. It took 3 men to sound the toll. But she didn't need to ring it. She just needed to wake it up. She threw her entire body weight against the clapper, swinging the heavy iron ball inside the bronze casing. Clang! It wasn't a sound. It was a physical blow. The Titan let out a metallic shriek that vibrated through the very marrow of their bones. Aveline gritted her teeth, the noise rattling her skull. But for Callista, it was agony. The she-wolf screamed, clamping her hands over her ears, falling to her knees. To a shifter, whose hearing was 10 times sharper than a human's, the sound was like a spike being driven into the brain. "Silas, stay down!" Aveline yelled, though she couldn't hear her own voice. She swung the clapper again, and again. Goong! Goong! The sound waves were visible in the dust, rippling the air. Callista was writhing on the floor, blood trickling from her nose and ears. Her wolf was panicking, trying to force the shift to escape the pain, but the sonic assault was scrambling her focus. She was trapped between forms, bones snapping and reforming, fur sprouting and receding. "Make it stop!" Callista wailed, clawing at the stone floor until her nails broke. "Surrender!" Aveline shouted, her own ears ringing, her vision blurring from the vibration. "Never!" Callista snarled. With a burst of desperate, maniacal strength, she forced herself to stand. She ignored the pain, ignored the bleeding ears, and charged. She hit Aveline hard. The impact knocked the wind out of Aveline. They tumbled across the stone floor, dangerously close to the open archway, and the 1,000-foot drop below. Callista's hands were around Aveline's throat, squeezing. "I will tear your throat out," Callista hissed, her eyes rolling back in her head. Aveline couldn't breathe. Black spots danced in her vision. She reached out blindly, her hand finding a loose iron pin from the bell's maintenance rig lying on the floor. She didn't stab Callista. She didn't have the angle. Instead, Aveline jammed the iron pin into the groove of the floor and leveraged her legs against Callista's stomach. "Fly," Aveline choked out. She kicked. Unbalanced and disoriented by the noise, Callista flew backward. She flailed, her claws scraping for purchase on the wet stone. But there was nothing to grab. She went through the archway. There was no scream. The wind took it. Just the silent disappearance of the threat into the abyss of the night. Aveline collapsed, gasping for air, her throat bruised and burning. The Titan hummed above her, the vibrations slowly dying down, leaving a ringing silence that was almost louder than the noise. The dawn broke grey and cold, illuminating the smoke rising from the battlefield. Cedric found them an hour later. He limped up the stairs, his golden armor dented, his sword chipped. He expected to find bodies. He expected to find silence. What he found was his son, asleep in the corner, wrapped in a curtain, and Evelyn sitting against the wall beneath the massive bell, staring out at the sunrise. Her neck was purple with bruises, and her hands were raw from the rope. "Evelyn," Cedric breathed, dropping his sword. She looked at him. Her hearing was still muffled, but she saw his lips move. She smiled weakly. "Did we win?" Cedric crossed the distance in 2 strides and fell to his knees before her. He didn't care about the dirt or the blood. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. He was shaking, tremors of an alpha coming down from the rage of war. The Northern Army broke when Callista fell. Cedric murmured against her neck. They saw her fall from the tower. They thought the moon goddess herself had struck her down. He pulled back to look at her, his thumbs tracing the bruising on her throat with agonizing tenderness. But it wasn't a goddess. It was you. "I just rang the bell," Aveline rasped, wincing as she swallowed. Wolves don't like loud noises. Cedric let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You fought an alpha princess with a bell. You are insane." "I am wolfless," she corrected softly. "I used what I had." "You have everything," Cedric vowed. "You have everything that matters." Later that day, the great hall was not filled with a celebration of war, but a gathering of witness. The survivors of the siege, nobles, soldiers, and servants alike, watched in silence. Cedric stood on the dais, but he did not sit on the throne. He held Silas's hand on his left, and Aveline's on his right. "The old laws say an alpha must mate with a wolf of equal strength," Cedric addressed the court. His voice was hoarse, but carried to every corner. "They say a wolfless is broken, empty." He looked at Aveline. He raised her bruised hand, pressing a kiss to her knuckles in front of the entire assembly. "We were wrong," Cedric declared. "The wolf is flesh. Flesh bleeds. Flesh dies. But spirit—" He looked around the room. "Spirit is what climbs a tower when the world is burning. Spirit is what saves a king when he is blind." He turned to Aveline, pulling a ring from his own finger, the signet of the Alpha, heavy gold and ancient. "I do not ask you to be my mate, for I cannot bite you," Cedric said softly, for her ears alone. "I ask you to be my equal. I ask you to be the silence that quiets my storm. Will you take this burden? Will you take this king?" Aveline looked at the ring, then at the man. She saw the fear in his eyes, not of war, but of losing her. "It is not a burden," Aveline whispered, taking the ring. It was too big, so she closed her fist around it, holding it against her heart. "It is a balance." Cedric smiled, and the sun seemed to break through the high windows, bathing them in light. He leaned down and kissed her, not acclaiming, but a surrender. And for the first time in the history of the 7 Packs, the court did not bow to a power they feared. They bowed to a woman who had saved them without lifting a sword. Aveline's story is a testament that we are not defined by what we lack, but by how we use what we have. In a world of noise and fury, she found strength in silence and strategy. She proved that you don't need claws to fight your demons, and you don't need magic to perform a miracle. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can be is simply, unapologetically, yourself. If this story of the Wolfless Queen resonated with you, and if you believe that love is the strongest magic of all, please like, share, and subscribe to join our pack. The moon shines for us all, wolf or not.